James never thought he'd become a revolutionary. He wasn't the type. He was just a regular guy living in suburban Florida, designing logos for small businesses and occasionally binge-watching crime documentaries. But one fateful morning, while watering his front lawn, destiny knocked, or rather, slid into his mailbox in the form of an HOA violation notice. The crime? His garden hose was green. Not just any green, mind you, unapproved green, according to the Homeowners Association, HOA. Apparently, the HOA had decreed that all hoses must be beige or white to maintain the visual harmony of the neighborhood. James stared at the letter, then at his perfectly functional hose and muttered, "Visual harmony? It's a hose, not a Picasso." This wasn't James's first run-in with the HOA. Oh no. The HOA was like a nosy neighbor on steroids, always watching, always judging. They'd previously sent him warnings about his mailbox being too whimsical, it had a tiny flag painted on it, and his Christmas lights being too bright as a festive cheer were a crime. But this hose debacle? This was new territory. It wasn't just absurd, it was personal. The violation notice came complete with a $25 fine and a stern warning: replace the offending hose within 7 days or face escalating penalties. James couldn't believe it. What's next, he thought. Are they going to regulate the color of my underwear? He decided to call the HOA hotline to clarify this nonsense. After navigating an endless labyrinth of automated menus, press 1 for lawn violations, press 2 for mailbox infractions, he finally reached Karen, the HOA president and self-proclaimed guardian of suburban perfection. Karen's voice was as sharp as her disdain for individuality. "Mr. James," she began, "the rules are in place to ensure uniformity and aesthetic appeal in our community." James tried reasoning with her. "Karen, it's a garden hose. It waters plants. No one's hosting art exhibitions in my yard." Karen didn't budge. "Rules are rules," she said with the smugness of someone who'd never been contradicted by anyone other than her cat. Faced with this bureaucratic absurdity, James did what any reasonable person would do: he turned to social media. He posted a photo of his green hose alongside the violation notice with the caption, "Breaking news. I'm officially Florida's most dangerous man, armed with an unapproved garden hose." The post went viral within hours. Neighbors chimed in with their own tales of HOA tyranny: fines for having flower pots that weren't HOA-approved colors, warnings about parking cars too symmetrically in driveways, and even citations for excessively cheerful bird feeders. One neighbor commented, "I got fined because my dog barked in an unpleasant tone." Encouraged by the support, James decided he wouldn't go down without a fight. He printed copies of the HOA rulebook and highlighted every ridiculous regulation he could find, like the one about lawn gnomes being banned unless they were under 12 inches tall or painted exclusively in neutral tones. James didn't just replace his green hose, he doubled down on defiance. He bought 10 more hoses in every shade of green imaginable and arranged them artistically across his lawn like some avant-garde installation titled Suburban Rebellion. He even added signs that read, "Visual harmony starts here," and "Green is the new beige." Karen wasn't amused. Within hours, she showed up at James's house with 2 other HOA board members, a trio he nicknamed the Beige Brigade. They stood on his driveway like suburban stormtroopers, clutching clipboards and radiating disapproval. "Mr. James," Karen began, her voice dripping with condescension, "this is a direct violation of community standards." James didn't flinch. "Karen," he replied, "I'm merely expressing myself through horticultural accessories." Karen threatened further fines and even hinted at legal action if James didn't comply. But James had done his homework. He knew that Florida law allowed homeowners some leeway when it came to landscaping choices. Word spread quickly about James's stand against HOA tyranny, and soon other neighbors joined his cause. One family decorated their mailbox with neon paint, another installed flamingos wearing sunglasses in their front yard. Someone even organized a petition demanding Karen step down as HOA president. Karen responded by doubling down on enforcement, issuing violations left and right for everything from mismatched patio furniture to unauthorized wind chimes. But her crackdown backfired spectacularly. The neighborhood transformed into a chaotic carnival of rebellion. Rainbow-colored fences appeared overnight, inflatable dinosaurs roamed front lawns, someone even built a pirate ship in their backyard complete with cannons that fired confetti. Amidst the suburban uprising, Karen called for an emergency HOA meeting to restore order, or so she thought. When James arrived at the meeting, armed with legal documents and several photos of Karen's own violations, he found himself greeted like a hero. Neighbors cheered as he presented his case. Not only were many HOA rules unenforceable under state law, but Karen herself had been violating several regulations, including parking her car too close to her mailbox and owning an unapproved bird feeder. Karen tried defending herself but quickly crumbled under pressure. By the end of the meeting, she resigned as president, a victory that sent shockwaves through the community. James didn't stop there. He used his newfound platform to advocate for reasonable HOA reforms, urging neighbors to prioritize community spirit over petty regulations. James thought his victory over the green hose debacle would buy him some peace. He was wrong. If the HOA was a petty tyrant, Karen was its ruthless enforcer, a suburban Napoleon with a clipboard instead of a sword. And she wasn't about to let James's rebellion go unpunished. It all started innocently enough. James, still riding high on his newfound fame as the neighborhood's anti-HOA hero, decided to spruce up his front porch with a cheerful yellow flower pot. It wasn't just any flower pot, it was a bright, sunny beacon of joy filled with marigolds that practically radiated happiness. But in Karen's eyes, it was an affront to everything the HOA stood for. The letter arrived 2 days later, folded neatly and sealed with passive-aggressive disdain. James opened it and read aloud, "Dear Mr. James, your flower pot violates HOA Regulation 14C, which states that all outdoor decorative items must adhere to approved color schemes, neutral tones only. Please replace or remove the offending item within 7 days to avoid fines." James laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. Neutral tones, he said to himself. What do they want me to do, paint it beige and call it a day? But Karen wasn't joking. She had attached a photo of James's flower pot as evidence, complete with a red circle around it like it was some kind of criminal mugshot. The absurdity was almost impressive. Determined to expose Karen's hypocrisy, James set out on a mission to document every single HOA violation in the neighborhood. Armed with his phone and a notebook labeled Operation Flowerpot Justice, he began his investigation. It didn't take long to find violations everywhere. Across the street, the Johnsons had a mailbox shaped like a fish, clearly not neutral-toned. Down the block, someone had installed solar lights that changed colors at night, a disco party for moths. And Karen herself? Oh, Karen had a pink flamingo lawn ornament hiding behind her hedges, a blatant breach of HOA decorum. James felt like Sherlock Holmes uncovering suburban crimes against humanity. He compiled his findings into a PowerPoint presentation titled HOA Hypocrisy, a Study in Beige. James didn't wait for another HOA meeting. He decided to confront Karen directly. He marched over to her house armed with his PowerPoint slides and knocked on her door. Karen answered, looking as though she'd just smelled something unpleasant, probably individuality. "Mr. James," she said icily, "what can I do for you?" James didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Karen," he began, "I couldn't help but notice your flamingo lawn ornament." Karen's face turned crimson. "That's not relevant," she snapped. "Oh, but it is," James countered, pulling out his phone and showing her the photo he'd taken of the offending flamingo. Regulation 9B clearly states that lawn ornaments must be neutral-toned or approved by the HOA board. "Do you have approval for this?" Karen stammered something about personal exemptions, but James wasn't buying it. "Karen," he said with mock sincerity, "I'm just trying to uphold community standards." Karen didn't take kindly to being called out. Over the next week, James received 3 more violation notices. One for having grass that was too tall. It was half an inch above regulation height. Another for leaving his trash cans out too early, by 15 minutes. And yet another for having Christmas lights still hanging on his porch in February. James knew this was war. Instead of removing his yellow flower pot, James decided to make it the centerpiece of an elaborate art installation on his front lawn. A display he called Suburban Resistance. He surrounded the flower pot with smaller pots in every color imaginable. Neon pinks, electric blues, fiery reds. He even added signs that read, "Freedom blooms here," and "Down with beige tyranny." Neighbors loved it. Kids came by to take selfies with the display. Someone even brought over cupcakes decorated like tiny flower pots in solidarity. Karen, however, was livid. She sent another violation notice demanding immediate removal of what she called an unsanctioned public spectacle. James responded by sending her a handwritten letter. "Dear Karen, my flower pots are an expression of my First Amendment rights. Please direct all further correspondence to my attorney." Inspired by James's defiance, other neighbors began pushing back against HOA rules in their own ways. The Johnsons painted their fish mailbox rainbow colors, The Smiths installed wind chimes shaped like dragons. Someone even planted sunflowers along the neighborhood entrance, bright yellow ones that could be seen from blocks away. Karen tried cracking down on everyone at once, but quickly realized she couldn't keep up with the sheer volume of violations. It was like trying to plug holes in a sinking ship while everyone else was drilling new ones. One evening, James received an anonymous envelope containing a petition titled, "Remove Karen as HOA President." It already had dozens of signatures from neighbors who were fed up with her reign of beige terror. James added his signature and posted about the petition on social media. "If you're tired of living under Karen's iron fist or clipboard, sign this petition. Let's bring some color back into our lives." The post went viral again, attracting attention from local news outlets who dubbed James the suburban revolutionary. Reporters showed up at his house asking for interviews. One even filmed a segment in front of his flowerpot display. Facing mounting pressure from neighbors and bad press, Karen called for an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called the growing threat to community order. But when she arrived at the meeting hall, she found herself outnumbered by angry residents holding signs that read, "HOA reform now," and "Beige is not a personality." James presented his PowerPoint slides detailing Karen's violations alongside photos of other ridiculous infractions enforced under her leadership. By the end of the meeting, Karen resigned as president, a moment met with cheers and applause from everyone except her loyal clipboard brigade. With Karen gone and HOA rules under review, James finally removed his flower pots, but only because he wanted to make room for something bigger, a community garden filled with colorful flowers donated by neighbors. As he planted marigolds alongside daisies and tulips, James couldn't help but smile at how far they'd come as a neighborhood, not just in fighting back against absurdity, but in reclaiming their individuality. As he planted marigolds alongside daisies and tulips, James couldn't help but smile at how far they'd come as a neighborhood, not just in fighting back against absurdity, but in reclaiming their individuality. If James thought Karen's resignation would end the HOA drama, he was sorely mistaken. Karen may have been dethroned as the queen of beige tyranny, but her loyal minions on the HOA board weren't about to let James and his merry band of flowerpot revolutionaries win so easily. No, they were determined to restore order, or at least their warped version of it. The new HOA president, a man named Gerald, stepped into Karen's shoes. Gerald was a retired accountant with a passion for spreadsheets and a personality as exciting as unbuttered toast. He wasn't as openly combative as Karen, but he had one thing she didn't: an obsession with rules so intense it could have been classified as a medical condition. It all started innocently enough, or at least James thought so. One sunny Saturday morning, James decided to celebrate Karen's departure by hosting a neighborhood barbecue in his backyard. To mark the occasion, he bought 2 inflatable pink flamingos and set them up on his lawn as decorations. They were cheerful, harmless, and most importantly, completely ridiculous. The flamingos were an instant hit. Kids played around them, neighbors took selfies with them, and someone even brought over a 3rd flamingo to complete the family. It was suburban bliss. But Gerald? Oh no. Gerald saw those flamingos not as harmless decorations, but as a direct assault on the sanctity of HOA regulations. 2 days later, James found another violation notice in his mailbox. This one was written in Gerald's meticulous handwriting and included a detailed explanation of how the flamingos violated Regulation 9B. All lawn ornaments must be neutral-toned and no taller than 12 inches. James measured the flamingos. They were 13 inches tall, 1 inch over regulation, 1 inch too much freedom for Gerald to handle. By now, James had become something of an expert in HOA bylaws, Florida state laws, and the fine art of trolling bureaucrats. He knew that Regulation 9B was technically enforceable but also absurdly outdated. It had been written decades ago when the neighborhood was first established and hadn't been revised since. So James did what any reasonable person would do. He filed an appeal with the HOA board. But instead of simply asking for leniency, he turned his appeal into a full-blown presentation titled, "In Defense of Flamingo Freedom." On the day of the appeal hearing, James arrived armed with visual aids, including charts showing how pink flamingos had become iconic symbols of suburban life in America. He even included a historical timeline tracing the origins of lawn flamingos back to their invention in 1957 by artist Don Featherstone, a detail that Gerald clearly did not appreciate. The appeal hearing turned into an absolute circus. Gerald opened the meeting by reading Regulation 9B aloud in his monotone voice, as if reciting scripture. "Lawn ornaments must be neutral-toned," he droned, "and no taller than 12 inches. James countered with his presentation, which included slides like "Why Pink is Practically Neutral" and "Flamingos, the Unsung Heroes of Lawn Decor." He argued that pink flamingos brought joy to the community and that banning them was not only unreasonable but borderline un-American. The neighbors who attended couldn't stop laughing, especially when James unveiled his piece de resistance, a photo of Gerald's own backyard featuring a garden gnome wearing a bright red hat. "Is this hat neutral-toned?" James asked with mock seriousness. Gerald turned beet red but refused to respond. Despite James's best efforts and several standing ovations from his neighbors, the board voted against his appeal. The flamingos had to go, or so they thought. James wasn't about to let Gerald win this round. He removed the inflatable flamingos from his lawn, but replaced them with something even more outrageous. A life-sized wooden cutout of himself holding a sign that read, "Free the Flamingos." Behind him stood an army of tiny plastic flamingos, each one exactly 12 inches tall and painted beige to comply with Regulation 9B. It was both petty and brilliant. Gerald was livid. He sent another violation notice claiming that James's wooden cutout was an unauthorized structure, and that the beige flamingos were a deliberate mockery of HOA rules. But by this point, James had become untouchable. His antics had made him a local legend, and even some members of the HOA board secretly supported him. Meanwhile, other neighbors began following James's lead. One family installed a giant inflatable unicorn on their front lawn. Another painted their driveway in rainbow colors. Someone even built a miniature replica of Stonehenge out of cinder blocks in their backyard. Gerald tried issuing fines left and right, but no one paid them. The neighborhood had turned into an anarchic wonderland where creativity reigned supreme, and it was all thanks to James. The final showdown between James and Gerald came one fateful morning when Gerald showed up at James's house unannounced, clipboard in hand and fury in his eyes. "Mr. James," he began sternly, "your continued disregard for community standards is unacceptable." James leaned casually against his mailbox, which now featured tiny pink flamingo decals, and smirked. "Gerald," he said, "I'm just following your rules. 12-inch ornaments only." Gerald pointed angrily at the wooden cutout. "That is not an ornament." James shrugged. "It's art." Their argument escalated until half the neighborhood gathered to watch like it was some kind of reality TV show. Someone even brought popcorn. Finally, Gerald snapped. "If you don't remove this nonsense," he shouted, "I'll take legal action." James grinned wider than ever before. "Go ahead," he said calmly, pulling out a folder labeled "Legal Precedents Against HOA Overreach." Inside were copies of court cases where homeowners had successfully sued HOAs for enforcing unreasonable rules. Gerald froze. He realized too late that he'd underestimated James, not just as a troublemaker but as someone who actually knew how to fight back within the system. A week later, Gerald resigned from his position as HOA president, citing personal reasons. The board decided to suspend all enforcement actions until they could review and update their outdated regulations, a process that would take months if not years. In the meantime, James threw another barbecue to celebrate his second victory over HOA tyranny. This time, instead of 2 inflatable flamingos, there were 20 plus one giant inflatable dinosaur wearing sunglasses for good measure. As neighbors laughed and cheered under the watchful gaze of pink plastic birds, James raised his glass and declared, "To freedom, and to never letting beige win." James had triumphed over Karen, survived Gerald's clipboard crusade, and turned his neighborhood into a colorful utopia of rebellion. But as the saying goes, victory is never final. The HOA wasn't done yet. Like a bad sequel to a movie no one asked for, the remaining board members regrouped and launched their most ambitious plan yet: a complete overhaul of the HOA bylaws. Their goal? To crush creativity once and for all. James knew this wasn't just about flamingos anymore. This was about principle. It was about freedom. It was about standing up to the beige overlords who thought they could dictate the color of your mailbox, the height of your grass, and even the tone of your dog's bark. This was war. The new HOA bylaws were leaked to the neighborhood via an anonymous source. Rumor had it Gerald accidentally emailed them to the wrong group chat. James read through the proposed changes with growing disbelief. James couldn't believe it. "Spark excessive joy?" he muttered. "Who wrote this? Ebenezer Scrooge?" James knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. He called an emergency meeting of his unofficial neighborhood resistance group, which had grown significantly since Karen's downfall. They gathered in his backyard, surrounded by flamingos, unicorns, and a life-sized cutout of Gerald. Someone had added devil horns to it. "Listen up," James began, addressing the crowd like a general rallying his troops. "The HOA thinks they can take away our flamingos, our unicorns, and even our joy. But I say we fight back." The crowd cheered. James outlined his plan. They would attend the upcoming HOA meeting en masse and demand that the proposed bylaws be scrapped entirely. If that didn't work, they'd stage a full-blown protest, complete with banners, lawn ornaments, and maybe even a marching band. Someone volunteered their cousin who played trombone. On the night of the meeting, James and his neighbors packed the community center like it was a sold-out concert. The remaining HOA board members looked visibly nervous as they faced an audience armed with flamingo-themed protest signs and homemade t-shirts that read, "Down with Beige Tyranny." Gerald wasn't there. He'd wisely decided to stay home. But his replacement, a woman named Linda, tried to maintain order. Linda was polite but firm, the kind of person who smiled while telling you she was fining you $100 for parking slightly crooked. "Thank you all for coming," Linda began in her overly cheerful voice. "Tonight we'll be discussing the proposed updates to our community bylaws." James raised his hand immediately. "Linda," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "can you explain why sparking joy is now considered a crime?" The room erupted in laughter. Linda tried to defend Regulation 67B by claiming it was meant to prevent excessive disruptions in the neighborhood. James countered by pointing out that joy wasn't disruptive. It was contagious. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their grievances with the HOA's draconian rules. Someone brought up how their kids loved playing with inflatable decorations during holidays. Another person mentioned how their elderly mother found comfort in colorful garden ornaments. By the end of the meeting, Linda looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and hide. Despite overwhelming opposition at the meeting, Linda announced that the board would vote on the new bylaws in 2 weeks. James knew this was their last chance to stop them, and he wasn't going down quietly. He organized what would later be known as the Great Flamingo Protest. Neighbors decorated their lawns with every colorful ornament they could find. Flamingos, unicorns, dinosaurs, disco balls, you name it. Someone even built a giant inflatable flamingo archway at the entrance to the neighborhood. James himself went all out. He rented a projector and displayed messages like, "Say no to beige," on his garage door every night leading up to the vote. Local media caught wind of the protest and sent reporters to cover it. One journalist interviewed James while standing next to his flamingo army. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. James grinned and said, "Because life is too short for beige." On voting day, neighbors showed up wearing flamingo hats and carrying signs that read, "Freedom over rules." The board members looked visibly overwhelmed as they faced an audience determined not to let them pass their oppressive bylaws. Linda tried her best to keep things professional but eventually cracked under pressure when someone presented her with a petition signed by nearly every homeowner demanding her resignation. In a shocking twist, one board member, previously loyal to Gerald, stood up and announced he couldn't support the new bylaws either. "I think we've lost sight of what makes this community special," he said solemnly. The vote failed spectacularly. The proposed bylaws were scrapped entirely. That night, James hosted another barbecue. But this time it wasn't just about celebrating victory over HOA tyranny. It was about celebrating community spirit. Neighbors brought food, drinks, and lawn ornaments galore. Someone even hired a local band to perform under a canopy of string lights. As James stood in front of his flamingo display holding a plate of ribs and a glass of lemonade, he couldn't help but feel proud. Not just of himself, but of everyone who had come together to fight back against absurdity. In hindsight, James realized that his battle with the HOA wasn't just about flamingos or flower pots. It was about standing up for individuality in a world that often tries too hard to enforce conformity. It was about finding humor in ridiculous situations and turning frustration into something positive. And maybe, just maybe, it was about proving that even in suburban Florida, one man armed with plastic birds could make a difference.